Hello, everybody. We have... Thank you. John Bogle has very graciously agreed to take a few more minutes and respond to some questions. I'm Bob Kuttner. I'm going to start the ball rolling with a couple of questions, and then we'll throw it open. So if you can see me, I'm going to sit back down now that I have your attention. And I know that one of Mr. Bogle's big issues is the need for investors to get organized. In his wonderful previous book, The Battle for the Soul of Capitalism, he talked about investors of the world unite. The problem, of course, is that the individual atomized investor is what economists would call a collective action problem. Organizing individual investors is like herding cats, and trying to get corporate executives to think in terms of the interests of their investors is, as Mr. Bogle said before, a classic agency problem, in the same way that investors being fleeced by other mutual fund companies, not Vanguard, is an agency problem. So I guess I have a two-part question. One, how in the world do we get investors organized? And two, to the extent that organizing investors won't solve all of the problems of financial markets that caused the crash, what else do we have to do in a regulatory way so that the interests of ordinary people and the real economy are served by the financial economy?
Well, I do have in my battle book sort of an escalatory statement based on Karl Marx, I guess. Investors of the world unite. And I think that would be very desirable, but as Bob says, that's not really something that's very easy to do. They have modest amounts of money. They have impressions of the market that generally are not right. If there was ever a good time to organize them, it is certainly not today when they're despondent, a lot of them, and shouldn't be, but they just have gone in the wrong direction and have lost half of their retirement account, and many have lost much more than that. But I'm not sure, having taken that strong position, that we really need to unite them. And that is, I think I mentioned this briefly in my remarks earlier, if you have an Adam Smithian kind of solution where each investor merely looks at his or her own interests and invests in a way that puts their own economic interests first, or does not ignore their own economic interests, you'll gradually get change without any kind of unity. Now, that said, and the regulatory reform is somewhere between this change that we must have and we will have. The idea that investors will be able to do this overnight, have that invisible hand work in the short term, simply isn't realistic. It will work in the long term, but time is money in this business, as we all know. And the most radical solution, which is the development of a definite federal standard of fiduciary duty, right out of the old English common law. I mean, that's the way I thought we were always supposed to act. Somewhere between them is really what we're talking about in the reforms, many of the reforms that have been brought up today. The SEC, I think, is a perfectly viable institution. I'm not at all sure about its recent leadership. I think Arthur Levitt did a great job at the political pressures he faced, which he talks about, were overpowering. Not overpowering, but in some cases, the separation of accountants' management consulting activities from their audit activities should be a no-brainer. Turned out not to be, but he finally got it done. And certainly the expensing of stock options, which he totally failed. Congress, I think, under Senator Lieberman, passed a bill 86-2 that said, or something like that. It was a huge, huge margin, saying that if the SEC was to require options to be expensed, they would do away with the SEC or the FASB or something like that. So make no mistake about the difficulty of it all. But we do need a regulatory agency, and I agree with one of the speakers this morning, I'm sorry, I can't remember who would have far fewer regulatory agencies, and we certainly don't need all those banking agencies. I have heard responsible people, one of the best, by the way, if you're interested in reading some pretty good stuff about this era, is Henry Kaufman, who did have a little money connected in the Madoff scandal, sadly, but I don't think it will bankrupt him in any way, shape, or form. He's too smart for that. But he would have the Fed merely regulate, he says, I think, the 10 largest banks, but the way the merger activity is going on, they could probably regulate the 3 largest banks or the 5 largest banks. And there used to be a rule, I'm not wise enough to know whether it actually exists or not, that no bank could have more than 10% of the deposit base in the country. And now we have 3 banks that are either there or going to be over there. So, you know, as that wonderful article in the Sunday Times, by the way, there's another really good piece of reading for you. It's the longest op-ed I have ever seen in the Sunday Times. It consumes two full pages by Michael Lewis and one of the hedge fund managers whose name escapes me, saying if we have organizations that are too big to fail, make them smaller. Break them. I mean, why not? Think about that. I mean, it must be time for bold thinking. And because it's ridiculous. And the whole bailout thing is an interesting quote in the Morning Times about can this financing go on forever? How much can the government guarantee before something happens? Nobody's ever answered that question, at least to my satisfaction. I think we're up to $2 trillion, give or take. Numbers that have talked about a year ago, you would have said, it is inconceivable. And yet it begins with I believe a 3-page bill submitted to the Congress. 3 pages to do that. Wow. Impressive. But banking regulation, I'm not sure I feel as strongly as that previous speaker about separating the Fed's responsibilities for the economy from its responsibilities in banking, because banking and credit is so central to the economy. So I'd be inclined not to do that. But I don't see really enough radical reform on the agenda. And I would have it. I mean, you certainly want to have reporting of derivatives and those transactions. That was one of the biggest outrages of this whole era. The exemption by the Commodities Future Trading Corporation of the requirement, the normal requirement that you have full disclosure and transparency. So that's something that has to change. And you know, I think we need some new standards for our money men. You know, if that fellow I talked about before who got $500 million for recommending Mr. Madoff's Ponzi scheme, to use the current word, if he said to his customer, you know, if I can get you over into that fund, I'll make $10 million. Why shouldn't he be required to say that? I don't see any reason he shouldn't. Why shouldn't mutual funds be required to tell you, last year our fees were, let me say, for you individually, $1,000. And then you can say, well, it was either worth it or it wasn't worth it. Everybody knows what these numbers are, but this industry doesn't want to disclose. Why shouldn't we have some requirements for proxy participation? You know, the mutual fund industry fought kicking and screaming not to tell our owners how we were voting their shares. Think about that. I mean, it's an outrage. Talk about an agency problem or the principals letting down their agents. So I'm not sure I have anything particularly more than that to say wise about the regulatory thing. It certainly failed us. We're going to have limitations on leverage in investment banks somehow. We're going to have some kind of quality standards. We're going to have to fix the rating agency problem. Now, Sean Egan of Egan-Jones spent 11 years trying to get registered. He gets paid by the investors, not by the rating by the companies that want to be rated. He spent 11 years awaiting his registration under the SEC as an approved rating agency. 11 years. Think about it. For the only guys doing it right. And then, a little inside story, they announced it in the exact way they get mad at Wall Street for doing when they announce earnings. They announced it Friday afternoon before Christmas weekend that he had qualified. You know, that is to say, I hope nobody catches this. So, I don't know, we have a lot of work to do.